Gentleman yields. Our members, other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record and without objection and by agreement between the chair and ranking member. The committee shall use an amendment roster today.
Mr. Chairman.
You're recognized.
Reserving the right to object, and I will not object, would the chair please explain the agreement regarding the amendment roster? I yield to the chairman.
And I thank the gentleman and all committee members for agreeing to use an amendment roster. We have agreed that the bills be open to amendment at any point and that we will take up the amendments in the order listed on the roster. The chair will allow members to offer amendments listed on the roster out of order to the extent practicable and in a manner not prohibited by the House or by the committee's rules. Amendments not listed on the roster may be considered at the conclusion of the consideration of the roster.
I thank the chair for this explanation and withdraw my reservation.
Pursuant to notice, one other note, we got a lot of bills today, and normally I like to give a little grace on the time, but I want to ask everybody to try to stay in your 5 minutes as much as you can today. It's going to be a long day if we don't. So, pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 9752, the Tren de Aragua Southwest Border Security Threat Assessment Act. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 9752, offered by Mr. LaLota, to require a Homeland Security Southwest Border Threat Assessment on Tren de Aragua and associated strategic plan and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with and it's considered read and open to amendment at any point. The gentleman from New York, Mr. LaLota, is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on his measure.
Thank you, Chairman. House Republicans have met the moment on the border. We've passed numerous bills to help secure our border, including H.R. 2, the Secure the Border Act of 2023. But we also have a lot of bipartisan support for our bills. We've passed off the House floor 12 bipartisan bills that help us fix the border. Recently, we passed the No Bailout for Sanctuary Cities Act, my bill, which would ensure that sanctuary cities do not get additional funding for the problems they're creating. But today, we have another opportunity to ensure a more secure border and hopefully get votes from both sides of the aisle on a very good common sense bill called the Tren de Aragua Southwest Border Security Threat Assessment Act. Tren de Aragua, an international criminal organization dubbed MS-13 on steroids, has arrived here at our doorstep and poses a direct threat to the safety of Americans everywhere. Tren de Aragua, or TDA for short, is an extremely violent transnational criminal organization that originated as a prison gang in Venezuela in the state of Aragua. Over the past few years, their reach has extended beyond Venezuela's borders and into our own neighborhoods as they seek to exploit weakness at our southwest border. In fact, since fiscal year 2021, nearly 870,000 Venezuelans have been encountered by U.S. Customs and Border Protection nationwide, and over 117,000 of them have been flown into the interior of the United States under this administration's mass parole program. Just think about that for a moment. This administration is facilitating the invasion of America. And within this group of 117,000 unvetted Venezuelan nationals are members of TDA who pose an imminent danger to our communities. This isn't just a talking point for politicians and cable news. It's a threat like never been seen before. It's here and it's real. Shockingly, a recent incident saw over 100 suspected TDA members cross our border in a single event, and they were not just crossing. They assaulted multiple law enforcement agents as they rushed the border. It's clear to me, Mr. Chairman, that TDA is not afraid to use violence to achieve their objectives, and this makes them a direct threat not only to our communities, but to those who have sworn to protect us. Recent reporting by the New York Times detailed how this gang has emerged as a new menace in New York City, where TDA's presence is becoming more and more apparent every day. They are operating within migrant shelters across New York City, where they recruit new members and operate with little to no oversight. In fact, in June, a 19-year-old Venezuelan migrant who admitted to being a member of TDA shot 2 police officers when they tried to pull him over while he was riding a scooter. Despite efforts by local and federal law enforcement to keep track of these criminals, the number of TDA members who have been arrested are just the tip of the iceberg. Currently, the NYPD has identified 24 confirmed TDA members in the city's criminal gang database, but we know the actual number is much, much higher. The TDA gang has members hide in plain sight. They communicate through encrypted messaging, and they move silently, making it incredibly difficult for law enforcement to track them down. But let's be clear here. They're not just isolated incidents of these crimes. They're part of a larger organized efforts to destabilize our communities. That's why my legislation is so needed. My legislation will require the Department of Homeland Security to conduct a comprehensive Southwest border threat assessment that would identify the criminal threats posed by TDA members who have entered our country and the threat posed by TDA members seeking to enter the United States illegally. It also mandates that DHS develop a strategic plan to mitigate these threats and prevent TDA from proliferating into the United States. We need a proactive approach, one that recognizes the evolving tactics of these criminal organizations. Texas Governor Greg Abbott recently designated TDA as a foreign terrorist organization, recognizing the severity of the threat. It's time for us, Mr. Chairman, to follow suit with decisive action that puts the safety of American citizens first. New Yorkers, particularly those in my district on Long Island, have experienced firsthand the terror inflicted by criminal organizations like MS-13. We must not allow TDA to establish a foothold in the United States and bring a similar wave of violence. I want to thank my good friends and colleagues in this committee, Congressman Esposito and Correa, for partnering with me on introducing these bipartisan legislation. Let's send a clear message today. The United States will not be a safe haven for violent criminal organizations like TDA. I urge all of my colleagues to join me in supporting this legislation to protect our communities, defend our borders, and ensure that American safety always comes first. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to speak on the bill?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Correa, you're recognized.
Chairman, I'd like to be recognized to talk about this legislation, Tren de Agua, Southwest Border Security Threat. Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to co-sponsor the Tren de Agua, Southwest Border Security Threat Assessment Act that's being considered before us at this moment. As I've said many times in this committee, we must do everything we can to protect the homeland in every specific community. And to do so, we need to gather the facts and intelligence on specific threats facing the homeland. And this legislation will provide Congress with the information on the threats posed by Tren de Agua, the transnational criminal organization from Venezuela that has been gaining prominence in the United States in recent months, terrorizing many communities, but especially many immigrant communities. This bill directs the Secretary of Homeland Security to submit to us, Congress, a threat assessment on Tren de Agua and an associated strategic plan to fight these threats, as well as threats from other transnational criminal organizations. Both the threat assessment and associated strategic plan are due to Congress within 1 year. We all want to make sure our communities at home are safe, that the homeland is safe, and this bill ensures that DHS has a well-informed strategy in place to protect our communities, our neighbors, from Tren de Agua. I want to thank Rep. LaLota and Rep. Esposito for working with me on this legislation, and I ask my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to speak on the bill? Mr. Esposito, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my good friend from Long Island, Mr. LaLota, and Mr. Correa for spearheading this bill. There is no question that the border crisis and terrible policies such as sanctuary cities have allowed violent gangs like Tren de Agua to flourish in the United States. To effectively combat gangs just like this, law enforcement professionals need better information. This bill is an important first step, arming the government and law enforcement with the information it needs to go after criminal organizations, specifically Tren de Agua. This bill will require DHS to submit to Congress a Southwest Border Threat Assessment regarding the violent gang. The threat assessment must include identification of current and potential criminal threats posed by members and their affiliates who are seeking to unlawfully enter the United States of America through the southwest border or exploit security vulnerabilities along the southwest border. Descriptions of their origins, strategic aims, tactical methods, funding sources, leadership structure, and growth and presence in the U.S. will be critically important to dismantling them. It requires Border Patrol to issue a strategic plan on how CBP intends mitigating the criminal threats identified in the threat assessment, as well as CBP's efforts to detect and disrupt this violent gang. Closer to home in New York, the New York Post recently published an article titled, "How New York City Sanctuary Status Allows Bloodthirsty Migrant Gang Tren de Aragua to Thrive in Big Apple Shelters." The article says that sanctuary city status allows the gang to flourish in migrant shelters and further hamstring cops while keeping immigration officials and other law enforcement professionals in the dark. Quote, "The gang has infiltrated the shelter system to build a criminal enterprise that peddles narcotics, smuggles weapons and women within the 5 boroughs and beyond to Long Island. But the restrictive policy largely bars the New York City Police Department from policing the facilities and prohibits the city from tipping off federal immigration agents about dangerous illegal immigrants. The gang has been blamed for sex trafficking, drug smuggling, police shootings, and exploiting migrants." Mr. Chairman, this is a perfect example of bipartisan legislation in order to keep this homeland safe and dismantle violent gangs. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to speak on the bill? Hearing none,